Hey, this morning at Dev Day, OpenAI announced their new ChatGPT Apps SDK and the ability for third parties to sort of build these like richer experiences that can actually come into the ChatGPT UI. Super neat and well worth watching the event recording if you haven't looked at it already. But I think to put this in context, this is OpenAI's third bite at the apple kind of making ChatGPT not just like a wildly successful consumer app, but also like an app distribution platform for third parties to build on top of. And the first two were custom GPTs, basically. I think it's fair to say those haven't caught on like wildfire with consumers. I think this is a very significantly different type of integration. It's more powerful, it's more interesting. There's more you can do with it as a developer. So I'm pretty excited. In a nutshell, this is definitely extending more from a technical perspective. This is extending more from like ChatGPT's MCP support, which they launched a few months ago, and extending it with not just the ability to like call APIs in your app and return structured information, but actually to return sort of these cool widgets or little mini apps that get displayed inside ChatGPT itself. You can kind of see that going on here with Zillow, and I think you get the picture. So I think if you've built MCPs in the past, you'll be well positioned to build one of these. What's interesting, even if you're not a developer, to know about this is how this is going to work from a distribution and like user acquisition and user relationship perspective. Maybe like the top thing that people ask me about with ChatGPT is like, how can I have a more native experience? Like, I think people are, asking about my brand, they're interacting with my content in ChatGPT. Like, how can I have a relationship with those users on more of a first party basis? And this could move you closer to that. If you build these apps and users install them, certainly you are going to have more control over what that user sees inside the app itself, not necessarily in the rest of ChatGPT, but inside the app. And you're also going to get some data inherently because, of course, these things are interacting with like your APIs and services. So you're going to just naturally have the records of those interactions. But there are some pretty significant caveats to how this is going to work from a distribution perspective, how it's going to work from a recommendation perspective, which is something OpenAI touched on in the event today, and then what you can do from like a data and sort of like marketing perspective for these apps. So if you dig into developer docs here, even if you're not a developer, I think it's worth taking a look at these guidelines. These are like the equivalent of the Apple App Store guidelines for ChatGPT. And I would say overall, like I would think of this as an Apple App Store model. This is definitely going to be curated. They're going to review apps. You have to submit them for approval. They have some specific policy criteria they're looking for, and you need to comply with those if you want to be available for consumers to actually like use these experiences inside ChatGPT. That's just sort of the ticket price to even have the experience available. If you want to be recommended by ChatGPT, which is something they talk about, hey, you have a user who's searching for homes, like maybe they recommend the Zillow app, you actually have to go further and comply with these design guidelines. So they call this enhanced distribution opportunities in the doc. I don't know if that's the marketing approved name. This is an even more stringent set of guidelines beyond sort of the basic like security, privacy, purpose ones they have in the overall doc. And my suspicion would be TBD how easy it is to kind of get through App Store review. As folks who've built for Apple know, that can be a fraught process at times. Hopefully will be easier here. My guess is, at least to begin with, it's going to be a pretty high bar to have ChatGPT proactively recommend your app to users. That's something that might be more accessible to sort of the largest, most well-known, sort of highest user trust brands. And it might be more of a business development or partnership process than it is just a matter of like, submitting an app and checking the right boxes. So I would sort of moderate your expectations about that. But it is really interesting to see that they're doing it all. And what's neat is they do have in this documentation some details about how that recommendation process might work for users in terms of what would cause an app to be recommended, right? And they highlight here that it's based on, conversational context, which makes sense, whether or not the user is specifically talking about the brand, which also I think makes sense, and even whether or not like your brand is surfacing in search results. So I do think there's like an interesting motion here that could end up playing out where like, a consumer is sort of finding your brand through ChatGPT's normal existing web search capability. And then if you do have one of these ChatGPT apps and it's enabled for discovery, enabled for recommendation, ChatGPT might say like, hey, like, do you want to upgrade sort of to the full app experience? And that would make a lot of sense for like an app like Zillow, for example, where like you can already search just Zillow listings through ChatGPT web search, but the experience isn't necessarily like very nice compared to using Zillow itself. So I think that's really interesting. And when folks have talked to me about like, how can we have this more native integration to ChatGPT and have this more direct connection to users, I think this is the kind of thing they've definitely been thinking about. How widely available this is going to be, I think is going to be a question, and we may not find out the answer for some time. So a couple things that I do think are worth highlighting in these policy documents. One is, who is this for? What is this for? What kind of apps should you be building? It's pretty clear in the docs that they want apps that are apps. So if you're thinking like, I have a website and I'll make that website an app, and your website like naturally very interactive, I would consider, doesn't really seem like OpenAI wants to do that. It seems like they want to continue to have you sort of be available through web search and retrieval. This apps model is more for apps where like you can take actions or generate content or like do some sort of richer interactive search, as in the example of Zillow. Also, if your app is behind a paywall or something like Spotify, so you have to have a Spotify account to stream, I suspect that also might pass the bar. Second, there's definitely a lot of restrictions here on what you can do from a privacy and data perspective. Again, you're inherently gonna get some data about users when they interact with these apps, but they're very clear that you're not supposed to like try to pull out more data about the user's overall ChatGPT conversation. And that makes sense. Those conversations can be like super, super privacy sensitive, which is why this data isn't available today in any first party way. But if you're thinking like the user will install my app and I'll automatically be able to like, once again, get a clearer picture of the user's entire customer journey in ChatGPT, I don't think that's going to be the case. That may be enforced more through policy than technology, but it's clear they don't want you to do that. And then lastly, I would just note like, there's some things in here that if you're like are familiar with building MCPs, you can kind of read between the lines and see where there's policy guidelines in here that are because of the state of the technology. And specifically, if you followed like things that Simon Willison, for example, has written about, like the lethal trifecta. The lethal trifecta, if you haven't read about it, is essentially the fact that like, LLMs are really smart, but they're also pretty easy to fool. And so the combination of kind of like third-party content and an LLM and access to like users' private data through these sorts of integrations can blow up really quickly and lead to like data exfiltration and data corruption, all sorts of nasty things. There's tons of things in the wild that you can read about if you look online for this. To me, it's pretty clear that they're solving for this in this app model through policy and review. And that's because, to the best of my knowledge, which I think is pretty good, there is as yet no technically foolproof method for preventing these sorts of security issues and privacy issues and so on and so forth with these types of integrations. That's true for MCPs. It's going to be true for this model as well because it's built on MCP. And, if they don't have some sort of review process in here, this is the type of thing that could be really dangerous actually for consumers. So I think, number one, it's not just because they want to control the ChatGPT user experience that they have this review process, although I'm sure there's an element of that as well. I actually think that like inherently where this technology is requires a little bit more curation. And I think that's for that reason, I don't think you'll necessarily see this change as quickly as you might expect. There's probably going to be a pretty stringent review process for some time, but I could be wrong and we'll find out more. In the meantime, I would definitely encourage folks to take a look at the docs. As always, OpenAI has produced pretty good technical documentation, and this is something that's available to play around with. So it's not yet available necessarily for you to like submit these apps and really get them in front of consumers in the immediate future, but you can start playing around. And in AI world, that's always a smart move because things move so quickly. There's no substitute for hands-on. I know that's what I'll be doing, and I'll share what I learn. If there's questions you have about this, or if you think I'm wrong, let me know in the comments.